Tokyo,
意を競ったこの聖域に
1943. The war rooms were silent.
United States aircraft carrier Hornet.
Japan's top admirals and generals sat around a long table, staring at reports that didn't make sense. Every number, every page, screamed the same thing. The war was already lost. It wasn't because of new bombs or secret weapons, but something far more terrifying: math. America's factories were producing faster than Japan could destroy. Ships, planes, tanks, all rolling off assembly lines like clockwork. What the Japanese command realized in that secret meeting was that the true weapon of the United States wasn't the military. It was industry itself. Stay until the end, because what they discovered will change how you see World War II. And don't forget to subscribe if you love history told without filters. Tokyo, 1943. A heavy rain fell over the Imperial Palace as the Japanese High Command gathered beneath the capital in a soundproof war room. The lamps burned low, the air thick with tobacco smoke and quiet dread. Maps stretched across the walls, red lines, blue arrows, front lines that shifted like dying embers. Around the long wooden table sat the men who had once commanded victory: generals, admirals, and intelligence chiefs who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, and swept across Asia with divine confidence. But tonight, none spoke. Their briefings were not about triumphs, but mathematics. A courier entered, drenched from the storm, carrying a stack of intelligence reports bound in red twine. The chief of staff slit the seal, his hands trembling slightly. Inside were numbers, production figures, logistics reports, intercepted communications from American industry. At first, they seemed impossible. A colonel leaned closer, whispering, "These must be errors." But the intelligence officer shook his head. "We checked them twice." The room stayed still. America was no longer the sleeping giant they had mocked. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Seattle now worked without rest. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Entire towns were building planes, tanks, and ships faster than Japan could destroy them. An admiral clenched his jaw. "We've underestimated their capacity," he muttered. No one disagreed. The reports painted a picture that chilled them more than any battlefield defeat. While Japan was rationing steel and fuel, the United States was drowning in production. For every Zero Japan built, America built 12 fighters. For every destroyer Japan launched, America launched 5. The men around the table realized they were staring at something far deadlier than bombs or bullets. It was arithmetic. Admiral Ugaki finally broke the silence. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "this war will not be decided at sea. It will be decided in the factories." The words echoed against the concrete walls. In that moment, the Empire's leaders understood what few dared to say aloud. Japan's greatest enemy wasn't America's Navy. It was America's math. The next folder laid open on the table was stamped with a single word: production. Inside were photographs smuggled out of the United States. Rows of assembly lines stretching further than the eye could see. Women in coveralls operated heavy machinery, sparks flying around them like fireflies. Teenagers loaded crates. Elderly men welded tank hulls. The American factory had become a living organism, breathing, grinding, and producing with mechanical precision. A naval engineer adjusted his glasses and read aloud, his voice shaking slightly. "Ford Motor Company, Willow Run Plant, output rate, 1 B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The room fell silent. Another admiral frowned. "That's impossible." "A bomber requires hundreds of thousands of parts," the intelligence officer replied quietly. Sir, they're using automobile assembly methods. It's true, the disbelief turned to unease. Japan's most advanced factories took weeks to build a single aircraft, and that was with full resources and manpower. Yet here was proof that one American plant could outproduce entire Japanese sectors. The generals knew Japan's factories were small, scattered, and constantly disrupted by shortages or air raids. The Americans, however, had built sprawling complexes inland, safe from attack, powered by endless coal, oil, and manpower. Another report stated that the United States had converted nearly every civilian manufacturer into military production. Typewriter factories now made machine gun parts. Piano companies built airplane wings. Even toy manufacturers were producing bullet casings. Then came the most devastating line in the report. Estimated industrial labor force, 60 million, including women and youth. Japan's total was barely a fraction of that. A general slammed his fist against the table. "They've mobilized their civilians," he shouted. The intelligence officer nodded. "Yes, sir. Their entire society is working as one machine." For the Japanese elite, this was more terrifying than any bomb. While their empire strained under shortages, America had become an engine that couldn't stop. Its output wasn't just growing, it was accelerating. Each month's total eclipsed the last. What the High Command finally grasped that night was that victory was no longer a matter of bravery or tactics. It had become a question of production speed, and Japan was running out of time. The next set of documents carried a headline that sent murmurs through the room: United States Maritime Commission, Emergency Shipbuilding Program. Admiral Koga leaned forward, scanning the first page, and froze. America had found a way to outbuild the sea itself. Before the war, Japan's submarines had been the silent predators of the Pacific, targeting cargo ships to choke off Allied supply lines. It had been an elegant, ruthless strategy: sink their fuel, sink their food, and let logistics destroy what soldiers could not. But this new American program, something called the Liberty Ship, had broken the logic of submarine warfare completely. The reports said these massive steel cargo ships were being produced faster than Japan could sink them. An intelligence officer read the line that made every man in the room stop breathing. Construction time: 4 days, 15 hours. The admiral beside him blinked. That must be an error. The officer turned the page. Photographs proved otherwise. Liberty ships launching one after another from the same dock, their hulls still steaming from welding torches. In Japan, a single merchant vessel took nearly 2 years to complete. America was building one a week at every yard. "What are they made of?" asked a general, incredulous. "Steel, sir." Prefabricated sections. They build each part separately, then weld them together like a puzzle. The room fell quiet again. Japan's craftsmen had spent decades perfecting the art of shipbuilding. Each vessel a masterpiece of precision. But in this new age of total war, the Americans didn't care about beauty. They cared about numbers. One admiral leaned back, whispering, "For every ship we sink, 3 more rise." It wasn't poetry, it was math. The submarine crews were reporting fewer victories. Torpedoes were running out faster than results. Convoys that should have vanished were now multiplying. The Liberty Ship program didn't just rebuild America's fleets, it flooded the ocean. Grain, oil, weapons, men, all crossed the Pacific in waves Japan couldn't stop. Each launch ceremony was another nail in the empire's coffin. The admirals realized that even if they destroyed half of America's navy, they'd never catch up. The enemy had turned industry into immortality. As the lights flickered from the generator above, One officer whispered what the others wouldn't dare say. "We can't outfight what they can outbuild." And in that moment, Japan's naval supremacy began to die. Not from gunfire, but from arithmetic. The mood in the room had shifted from disbelief to dread. Admiral Yamamoto's warning from 2 years earlier now echoed like a prophecy fulfilled. He had told them plainly, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." At the time, his words were brushed aside. America, they thought, was soft, materialistic, unprepared for long war. But now, as the reports continued to pile across the table, everyone knew he had been right. The giant wasn't just awake, it was running at full speed. The intelligence reports showed something far beyond the military. American production had multiplied 5 times over since Pearl Harbor. In aircraft manufacturing alone, the numbers bordered on insanity. Factories that had once made cars now turned out bombers in endless lines. One plant produced more planes in a single year than Japan could build in 5. Every 24 hours, hundreds of engines, thousands of rifles, and tens of thousands of shells left assembly lines across the continent. A general rubbed his temples and muttered, "They're not even fighting at full capacity yet." The line hung in the air. America still had factories transitioning to war work, still training workers, still scaling up steel and oil production. What they were seeing wasn't America's maximum effort. It was just the beginning. Yamamoto had spent time in the United States, studying at Harvard and touring their industries. He had seen the highways, the railways, the oil fields stretching beyond the horizon. Most of his peers had dismissed his concerns, assuming Americans lacked the discipline to fight. But Yamamoto had seen something deeper, their ability to unite when threatened. "They are slow to anger," he once said, "but when aroused, they are like a typhoon." Now, that typhoon was turning across the Pacific. The American spirit, innovation, cooperation, relentlessness had become their greatest weapon. The Japanese High Command sat in silence, realizing the bitter truth. The industrial machine they had mocked was now an unstoppable force. Every bolt, every bullet, every plane represented not just machinery, but the will of millions. The sleeping giant wasn't just awake. It was building its own destiny, one factory shift at a time. The next report wasn't about ships or planes. It was about math, cold, brutal arithmetic that no amount of courage could erase. Japan's intelligence officers had compiled data from across the Pacific and Europe, and what they found made victory impossible to even imagine. The numbers were staggering. America was producing more steel in 1 month than Japan could forge in an entire year. Their oil output from Texas alone dwarfed Japan's entire empire. They refined more rubber synthetically than Japan could ever import. Their aluminum factories worked around the clock, feeding endless streams of bombers into the sky. One officer read the figures aloud, his voice trembling. Over 300,000 aircraft projected by next year. Another quietly whispered, "That's more than our total arsenal since the war began." Japan's generals stared at the charts, columns of red ink marking shortages of coal, copper, oil, and manpower. The empire had spread too far, too fast. Its supply lines stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean. Every new conquest added territory to defend, not resources to use. The colonies that were supposed to feed the war machine instead drained it dry. Meanwhile, America's machine only accelerated. Assembly lines once dedicated to cars and washing machines now churned out tanks and jeeps. Civilians had become soldiers of industry, women working double shifts, teenagers welding steel, old men driving forklifts at shipyards. In every town, church bells signaled not worship, but production quotas met. Henry Ford's assembly line methods had transformed warfare. Factories that once took weeks to make a car could now build a bomber in hours. The B-24 Liberator alone required over 500,000 parts. Yet Ford's Willow Run plant was completing one every 63 minutes. The Japanese officers stared at that number again, as if repetition might make it false. It didn't. A general broke the silence. This isn't a war anymore. It's an equation. And he was right. Japan's courage, training, and sacrifice meant nothing against production measured by tons instead of troops. Every day, America's output widened the gap until it wasn't a contest. It was a countdown. The Japanese high command realized what no one dared to say aloud. The war was already over. They were simply watching the math catch up. By late 1943, Japan's empire stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands. On maps, it looked vast, unstoppable, a crimson sweep across the Pacific. But the illusion of dominance was collapsing from within. The next set of intelligence reports exposed the empire's fatal flaw. They controlled land, but not the means to use it. An admiral spread a chart across the table. "We have territory," he said, "but we cannot move its resources." Japan's oil came from Indonesia, its rubber from Malaya, its ores from Manchuria. Every drop and ounce had to cross an ocean infested with American submarines. Convoys were being hunted mercilessly. In just 1 month, Japan had lost over half its merchant shipping. Fuel reserves were vanishing. Aircraft carriers were anchored in port, not from strategy, but from empty fuel tanks. Another report detailed the U.S. submarine campaign, Operation Starvation. The Americans weren't just sinking warships anymore, they were targeting Japan's lifelines. Oil tankers, freighters, and transport vessels were vanishing at sea, leaving entire factories idle. Japanese steel mills in Kobe ran out of iron ore. Aluminum plants closed. Entire shipyards were abandoned for lack of materials. A general pointed bitterly to the American mainland on the map. They sit protected between two oceans. No bombers reach them. No submarines touch them. Their factories hum without fear while ours burn. He was right. America's heartland had become an untouchable fortress of production. Its supply lines were short, its resources endless. Japan's, by contrast, were stretched so thin that one destroyed tanker could collapse an entire region's output. As Tokyo rationed coal and fuel, American cities glowed brighter. Their farmers grew more food than they could eat. Their refineries overflowed with gasoline, their ports stacked with ammunition and machinery. And worst of all, the U.S. had barely mobilized its full industrial capacity. Only a fraction of its potential was in use. The Japanese high command stared at the final line of the report. They have enough oil and steel to fight for 10 more years. The room went silent. 10 years. Japan's reserves, by comparison, were measured in months. The realization was crushing. The empire was fighting a superpower that hadn't even begun to struggle. The question was no longer if they would lose, but when. The final folder in the intelligence stack was different. It wasn't stamped production or logistics. Its title was simple, handwritten, America's True Weapon. Inside was a report that struck the officers harder than any bomb or battle could. It wasn't about ships, aircraft, or oil. It was about something Japan could never match: potential. One intelligence officer stood as he read. "The United States," he began quietly, "is operating at less than half its total war capacity." The words felt surreal. Less than half. That meant America was winning without trying its hardest. Every factory they'd studied, every statistic that had terrified them for months, represented only the beginning. The industrial giant hadn't even reached full power. "Impossible," a general muttered, shaking his head. But the data was irrefutable. The report explained how the U.S. economy, still converting from civilian to wartime production, continued to expand every month. Entire new industries were rising out of empty farmland. Steel mills, shipyards, ammunition plants, each larger than Japan's entire industrial base. Their workers were still being trained, their machines still being installed. Yet even at half strength, America was producing more than all Axis nations combined. Then came the part that silenced the room entirely. "They're not motivated by fear," the officer said. "They're motivated by unity." In Japan, resources were controlled by the military, production by rigid bureaucracy. But in America, every citizen, from farmers to teachers, had become part of the war machine voluntarily. Housewives welded aircraft wings. College students melted scrap for bullets. Hollywood actors sold war bonds. The entire nation had turned its daily life into ammunition. An older admiral finally spoke. "So, their strength isn't just in factories," he said. "It's in spirit." And that realization hurt more than any defeat, because spirit could not be blockaded, bombed, or burned. The Americans had achieved something Japan's leaders had never believed possible. They had turned freedom itself into a weapon. As the meeting dragged into the early hours of morning, the Japanese High Command sat in stunned silence. They understood now this wasn't a battle between armies anymore. It was a race between nations, and one of them had already crossed the finish line without realizing it. America's true weapon wasn't the bomb or the battleship. It was a limitless will to build, fight, and endure. When dawn crept through the blackout curtains, the war room had fallen silent again. The reports lay scattered across the table. Numbers, graphs, maps, and intercepted communications that together told one unmistakable truth. Japan's empire was finished. Not in theory, not in spirit, but in fact. Every man in that room understood it, though none dared to speak first. At last, one general broke the quiet. "We misjudged the enemy," he said. "We thought we were fighting soldiers." He paused, his gaze heavy. "But we were fighting a nation." The realization struck them all at once. Japan had fought this war with warriors, men bound by duty, by tradition, by the Bushido Code. America, on the other hand, fought with something far more terrifying: collective determination. Entire communities were turning out planes and ships as if it were a sacred calling. Housewives skipped sleep to work night shifts. Children gathered scrap metal from the streets. Men too old for the battlefield found new purpose on the factory line. The generals had believed morale was Japan's strength: discipline, obedience, sacrifice. But America's morale came from something else entirely: unity. Their democracy had not made them soft, it had made them unstoppable. They weren't commanded to serve, they chose to. As one admiral leafed through the final page, he found a line from an intercepted speech broadcast in the United States. "We will build until they cannot break us, and fight until they cannot replace their dead." The words lingered like a prophecy. An older officer closed his folder and sighed. Yamamoto was right. The sleeping giant is fully awake around him. The men nodded in quiet agreement. They all remembered Pearl Harbor, the moment that had filled them with pride. But that same moment had also doomed them. They hadn't destroyed their enemy that day. They had given him purpose. No amount of tactics, bravery, or divine wind could change what the numbers revealed. Japan had ignited a war it could not sustain against an opponent whose strength wasn't measured in weapons, but in will. And as the lamps flickered out in that underground room, every man present knew the empire's fate had already been written, not by generals, but by workers on the other side of the Pacific. By early 1944, the High Command no longer debated victory. They discussed survival. The meeting that had begun with confidence years earlier now ended with silence, resignation, and the soft scratching of pens signing reports they no longer believed in. The Empire's fate was sealed not by a single battle, but by the relentless rhythm of American industry. Japan's skies were dark with smoke, its factories crippled by shortages, its navy a ghost fleet scattered across the Pacific. The admirals knew they could not rebuild. For every ship Japan lost, America launched 10. For every pilot trained in Tokyo, America trained 100 in Texas. The arithmetic had become annihilation. Even divine wind could not stop mathematics. One officer stood and closed his folder. "It's no longer war," he said quietly. "It's attrition, and we are the ones being counted." The others didn't answer. They had seen the latest reports. Tokyo's fuel reserves dwindling, soldiers fighting on empty stomachs, civilians melting down pots for scrap. The American bombers hadn't yet arrived in full force, but they would. The machine across the ocean was still gathering speed. In those final months, Japan learned the true meaning of Yamamoto's prophecy. The sleeping giant had not just awakened, it had evolved. Its people had turned unity, innovation, and sheer productivity into weapons as powerful as any bomb. No fleet, no fortress, no faith could outlast an enemy that rebuilt faster than anyone could destroy. As the meeting dissolved, the officers left one by one, their polished boots echoing on the marble floor. Outside, Tokyo's skyline flickered with distant fires, factories working through the night, still clinging to hope. But deep down, each man knew the truth. The war had been lost long before Hiroshima. It had been lost the moment they underestimated a nation's will to build. And as dawn rose over a weary empire, the same thought echoed through every mind in that room. The giant was awake, unstoppable, and already writing the final chapter of World War II. One rivet, one plane, one ship at a time.